Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is Father Robert Miller, author of a new book about Catholic priests in the American Civil War. How you doing today, Bob?
Very good, Chris. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm trying to make sure I've got all of the moving parts straight in my head here. So the book is called Faith of the Fathers,
Right.
and it is the first comprehensive history of Catholic chaplains in the Civil War. And you spend some time at the beginning talking about like previous attempts to come up with some sort of account and accounting of Catholic chaplains, but this is really kind of the first time someone's been able to really get their arms around.
Yeah. In the book, I talk about the fact there was a doctrinal dissertation done literally, oh my God, 75 years ago. And it's the one go-to thing that people have been referring to for literally 75 years with all the names of the chaplains and stuff. And so, but it was badly outdated, number one, and obviously didn't have the advantage of modern scholarship. And then other books through the years have done things, Gratian Krasuski and Endres and Kurtz out of Notre Dame and a few others have given their lists, and they're much more accurate as we get closer. But I've been working on this for 20 years, digging through the depths, just trying to narrow down official and unofficial ones, which is one of the distinctions I make in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is it you decided to take on this task?
Well, it started off with actually this book right here. You can see it over my shoulder here. Both prayed to the same God. I started 2007. It was published. First, really book length story of religion and faith in the Civil War. And I came out with that one in 2007. And at the time, when I was doing research, I started stumbling in, obviously, to these priests. You know, Corby, most obviously, with the Irish Brigade and his famous general absolution, but other ones too, Jesuits who seemed to be under every rock in the Civil War. And then I started saying, I got to keep track of these guys. So I started doing bios on every one of them. And that became my fascination over a 20-year period, just slowly getting the names, filling out the bios, going in the weeds, internet, books, diaries, whatever, trying to track down these guys. So in the end, I came up with 126, although only about 74 were official, and the rest were unofficial. But that's where it comes from.
And a couple times as we've chatted, we've used the word list, but this is much more than a list. This is a nice narrative history, but it's topically oriented as well. So I found it to be just really well organized and richly organized to tell a
Thank you.
nice comprehensive story. So comprehensive is um, they're not overselling the word.
Right, yeah, and I didn't choose the second half of that title, by the way. That was a Notre Dame add-on. So I just wanted to call it Faith of the Fathers. They tagged on comprehensive. But yeah, you're right. And one of the review I think you guys are going to publish on Emerging on your blog talks about that, the fact that I didn't take the approach of generals in gray or generals in blue, where it's just simply a biographical listing. I want to do it thematically. So the book really organized itself around chunks. So, for example, the Notre Dame guys, there were 7 of them. Jesuits, 21, no surprise. And then the guys, I call them the unconventional. These are fascinating guys. Unconventional guys in unconventional places. Andersonville, for example, people have no idea there were 6 priests there. Um, Father Tracy, my favorite guy, chaplain for both sides, things like that. So organizing it thematically kind of makes it flow a little more better, I think, with the overall theme of different sections. So
Yeah, you mentioned there too, the one priest there ministering to both sides, but you really kind of talk about how, yeah, maybe there is some North and South partisanship, but really the central identity of being Catholic is really the guiding force for all of these
exactly.
guys.
Exactly. And it makes common sense that in terms of the religion and the Civil War, which is one of the reasons I started writing on this, because there's not a whole lot of focus on it. The only major denomination, aside from Judaism, that didn't split over the Civil War was Catholics. Obviously our authority structure is very different with the Pope in Rome. So the priest in different parts of the country supported the soldiers in their part of the country. But primarily, by and large, there were certainly exceptions, but by and large, the priests were not very partisan, shall we say, with taking strong sides. They tended to work with the troops that were in their regiment or in the hospital, if the case may be. And if they ran across others who were Catholic who wanted their services, if they were Confederate or Union, fine. There's some fascinating stories they tell in the book about that. And Tracy is my favorite one. I'm actually trying to pull together a bio on him right now because he started off down south in Huntsville, Alabama, just informally serving the troops down around Mobile. And then he got involved with the hospitals as Confederate wounded started coming in. And then he got captured by the Union. And lo and behold, I'm making this very short. He got captured by the highest ranking Catholic officer in the Union Army, which is Rosecrans.
Right, right.
And Rosecrans said, "Oh my God, I got a Catholic priest here." And actually, he had 4 or 5. He didn't know it probably. He says, "Come on to my tent." So he made him as kind of his personal chaplain.
Oh,
And then
wow.
the General David Stanley, who kind of rescued him from this hard ass, pardon the expression, hard ass Union sergeant, was ready to throw him in jail because he had a bag that said Mobile, Alabama on it. And he figured he was a secesh preacher. So Stanley walked in the tent and rescued him. They became big buddies.
Oh, okay.
Stanley had actually been searching in his own faith journey, and about 2 weeks later, he converted and became Catholic,
Oh,
and
wow.
Tracy baptized him.
Okay.
So it's fascinating stories between these guys. Yeah,
Wow, wow. Well, let's maybe kind of give us a foundation to start with. What did it mean to be Catholic in the early 1860s? And I'm sure it was a different experience than it is for Catholics today in some regards, at least.
good question. Good question, Chris. The kind of the foundational question. The basic history of America is of a Protestant country, primarily Calvinist roots, But as we all know, the famous Irish potato famine and the immigration was beginning to really surge 1840s, 1850s, and so that was dominating the scene. Irish flooding into the country, pretty poor, didn't have much, so a lot of them wound up signing up for the armies. Obviously, most of them were Catholic. And so there's debate on this. Dr. Mark Knoll and I, who's a friend of mine, he discussed it with me too. There may have been more Catholics in the country at the time of the Civil War than there were Protestants, but they were absolutely no social power, no organization. They were just trying to build churches like crazy. So there's a lot of wrestling for their identity. Prejudice was a huge issue. Everybody's probably heard the joke, no Irish need apply, and it
Yeah.
was very true. Part of the whole Irish riots in '63 in New York were the African Americans and the Irish and the various politics going on at the time. So that was a big factor. And then just getting into the armies in some cases, there was some resistance on the behalf of some regiments and some Protestants in the regiment who didn't want Catholic chaplains. A couple were elected, and there's a couple neat stories of guys who came in and were elected and actually won over the regiment. In fact, the majority of them who were there kind of won over a lot of the troops because one of the things I like to say in the book is that the best chaplains were not narrowly Catholic or narrowly partisan for whatever denomination. They were able to work for a lot of different people at the time. I think the group, ironically, if a couple of books hadn't been written already, the nuns, the 600 Catholic nuns, are an utterly fascinating story. Only trained nurses in America at the time, with background in things like the Crimean War. Some of the nuns had already started hospitals in America, so they had experience. The stories, conversion stories, are incredible, are off the charts. You could argue they had a bigger impact, and they did. Probably had a bigger impact on the average soldier than the priest did. Because when you're wounded in the hospital and in trouble, the Catholic nuns, and it was some hilarious stories. These soldiers, Southern soldiers, had never seen a nun, and they said, "Who are you? Are you male or female? Your voice is of a woman, but what are you dressed like that for?" So really, Catholics were slowly gaining new reputation in the country. It took a long time to do it, but the Civil War really moved it forward a lot more.
It seems to me that of course, the war breaks down a lot of social barriers because you have so many people from so many different backgrounds pushed together for the first time ever in their lives. And so, oh, maybe I've heard about what a Catholic is like, but now I've got some guys who are in the regiment next to mine, for instance, and I get to know them as people. And oh my gosh, you're a
Yeah,
lot more like me.
yeah,
And so,
yeah,
like, there's this real leveling effect that takes place that,
very much so.
yeah.
Yeah, the chaplains too. One of my favorite. There's two diaries of Catholic chaplains, too, and they're both utterly outstanding. The famous one is Corby, Memoirs of a Chaplain's Life, obviously Notre Dame. The other one that people don't know about is a Confederate, Father Sheeran, James Sheeran, 14th Louisiana, and his book's about this thick. I've got it up here on my shelf. Like it's right over there, actually. It's a marvelous book, and he tells stories, as does Corby. Sheeran was more interacting with other troops. They would have many other people who are not Catholic that would come to the services.
Yeah.
So yeah, they'd preach to Catholics, not always the mass. Sometimes they would just preach and pray and say a rosary. And then, boy, they'd have other people coming, especially during the time of the Great Revival, quote unquote, roughly 1863 to the end of the war, when soldiers were looking for God, when they
Mhm.
realized this war is not ending. And they began looking above them for greater values and a higher power. More and more people started attending, even if it wasn't a Protestant, they would go to the priest, as long as he was a good preacher and he
Yeah,
preached
right.
the word, they would go to, and Catholics would go to other ones as well.
Yeah. What was it like to be a priest in 1861? And again, if folks weren't paying attention, you're a retired priest, so
Right.
maybe you don't look like what people might think of a priest looking like because
Yeah.
you don't have the collar and the black. But
Yeah.
I'm sure in 1861 it was even more different.
Oh, yeah. I think I would have been a good chaplain in retrospect because the key for a chaplain is a jack of all trades. You have to
Right.
be able to do a little bit of everything. And I was a pastor for 35 years in inner city Chicago. So I know about doing a little bit of everything in the parish. But the priests of the day, and I write about this in the book, were in a fascinating position. If you know anything about Catholic theology, the event that really changed the church was Second Vatican Council in 1960s. Well, this was obviously pre-Vatican II, but it was pre-Vatican I
Mm,
even. And so the priests were caught in this, especially the bishops, were caught in this conundrum. Rome and the Vatican did not understand American democracy.
okay.
I mean, they were still very much into divine right leadership, things like, for example, freedom of the press that we take for granted. They didn't have that in the Vatican. It was controlled and run by the church in many ways, and in many European countries as well. So a lot of the priests had a tough time. Now, more on the leadership level, Bishop Hughes in New York and others, McGill in Richmond and others would try to explain to the Vatican, this is not, we're not opposing Rome. Democracy is a good thing. We can flourish in it. We can have our own way. So it was tough for these priests to do it. The second thing that strikes me personally as a priest is these guys work their tail off.
Yeah.
I will never complain again about my life because they're riding horses. I mean, the chaplain I referred to earlier, my quote unquote favorite guy, Jeremiah Tracy, before he went down south because of health reasons in 1860, he was a priest for 10 years in the Nebraska, Kansas territory. And he
Mm,
rode his horse everywhere over that vast area. He visited Indian tribes. He visited soldiers in the forts. He started a city, literally, organized a wagon train of Irish immigrants to settle in Nebraska. And they would sleep outdoors under the sun. Sometimes didn't know where their meal was coming from. I mean, there's no 7-Eleven or Kroger's around there. If they found a Catholic family, the Catholic family would take them in and give them a meal in the bed. So it was a rough time. And during the war as well, the chaplains had, many of them had an orderly if they were with the regiment for a while, and the orderly would help with food and fire. But a lot of times they got caught in a march, and the army was on the move. The priests suffered like everybody else. They had to find food. They lost their mass kit, had to figure out where they're going to eat at. So they had a little more advantage in the fact that they were officers, captains. So many times they associated with the officers in the army a bit, especially the medical staff. So that would help them a bit. And then a lot of times the Catholic priests, when they came to a town that had a church, they would visit the church,
okay.
probably to get a good shower and to get a meal and to get a good bed for a night or two. So
Yeah.
that was kind
Are,
of the lived experience.
are they having to like carry their vestments with them? And you mentioned a mass kit for folks who aren't
Yep.
familiar with that. Maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, they would have had to have, I mean, to do Catholic Mass in the 19th century, it was the Latin Mass. Let's just say it that way. So this long before the changes. So Latin Mass, formal vestments, which would have included one, two, three, four, five different things you had to put on. I won't go through all the details. Five of those, a missal for the altar, a missal with the readings, chalice, paten, linen, wine, bread. All of this was carried in a trunk, in a wagon. And sometimes if the chaplain was lucky and had good connections, he would get a tent, but that was kind of rare. Well, what happened to wagon trains?
Yeah,
We all
right.
know they get captured, or when something happens or destroyed. So I ran across numerous instances where priests said, I lost my vestments. I ran out of wine. And I'm saying mass, I ran out of wine. I got to go and take a week off to get restocked and come back again. So
Mhm.
they had a lot more stuff that they had to carry just to perform their duties.
Yeah. And was the church as an organization supportive of these men being on the field, or is it something they?
Good question. Good question. It's more a matter of the dioceses and the bishops.
Okay.
Many bishops were. And in the back of my book, I list all the dioceses that were in the country at that time. And roughly maybe 40% of them had priests from the diocese that served as a chaplain. Um, but some bishops were notoriously reluctant to let them go because Irish were flooding into the country. They didn't have parishes.
Yeah,
They
okay.
didn't have churches, so they were looking to start parishes. Obviously, you need a priest to start it. So some of these guys were reluctant. Archbishop John Hughes, arguably the most prominent Catholic bishop in the country at the time, in the beginning of the war, he was kind of reluctant. He didn't want to let too many people go.
Yeah.
People like Spalding in Cincinnati was a different story. In Purcell, they were much more open to letting their priests be chaplains as much as they could. Down south, for example, a perfect example, some of these dioceses, Mississippi, Diocese of Biloxi, the whole state was their diocese. And William Elder, an amazing guy, a northerner who was the bishop, almost every priest in his diocese somehow served in the war.
Yeah.
Because, well, the troops, if you know anything about the Civil War, troops were all over the state. And so he didn't want any of his priests to be chaplains if he could. So he would try to send them temporarily to help out. So some bishops nearly all were not, nobody was against it, but some were more reluctant than others to send. The other distinction worth making, again, understanding Catholic theology, you have priests that belong to a diocese with a bishop and priests that belong to a order, a religious order, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans. Obviously, we have our last two popes have
Yeah.
been religious order priests. Well, religious orders were generally a little easier to get priests from because they tended to do not just parish ministry and they could be released more. Notre Dame's a classic example of that. They were educational and they sent 7 guys because they were a little easier to move out of the institution temporarily.
Yeah, yeah. I'll give a shout out since I teach at St. Bonaventure Franciscan University. I'll give a shout out to my friends in the order there.
Five Franciscans served too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you mentioned the 7 guys from Notre Dame, and sort of like talk about them being trailblazers in a lot of respect as well, because you talk about them as being the first 7. Um, what is it that's so important about the precedents they set, the example, they're out there in a way that I think is really high profile. Uh, why is that so important?
Excuse me. Well, chaplains in America, this is the talk I'm giving right now. I'm doing a lot of talks on the book, and I talk about the title of my talk is From Rome to Appomattox. So the history of chaplains
Oh,
actually
well,
goes
yeah,
back to the Assyrians, strangely enough, the Bible, and the Druids. Bottom line is, in America, by the time of the Civil War, we'd had chaplains for about 80 years, but they were not as directly spiritually focused. It goes back to George Washington, actually, who during the Revolutionary War authorized the use of chaplains in the army. But at the time, he wanted to be a connection between um, the people and the officers and the soldiers. So they would teach classes, they would write
yeah,
letters, they did a lot of non-clerical stuff, and that was one of the complaints of chaplains on the onset of the Civil War. There was a lot. Jefferson Davis, for example, did not have a very high opinion. He supported chaplains, but his kids were educated in Catholic schools, by the way. but he didn't have a high expectation of chaplains because the chaplains at West Point were not known as highly spiritual men. They're more teachers. So the early days of the war, they really had to prove themselves. And
Yeah.
there were bad chaplains. I mean, early in the war, not so much Catholic, but they're of the about 2,400 Union, 1,300 Confederate, roughly. There were some bad ones in the beginning, and
Yeah.
some of them were older. Some of them were out for money. Some of them used their position for advantage. So it was a tough time. So they had to win their acceptance. So I always say the three things that chaplains had to have was faithfulness, flexibility, and courage. In other words, you had to
Mm,
be faithful to your job. So if you do what you're supposed to do, have services, visit the troops, things like that. Number two, you had to be flexible. I mean, you know how the Civil War demanded all kinds of things. So there's chaplains who, Catholic chaplains who, for example, when their regiment was out of ammunition, they would run and get ammunition a
okay.
couple of times and bring the ammunition back. They would drag the wounded off the field. They would write letters that they needed. They would actually take soldiers' pay to the post office. And there's some fascinating stories. Father Cooney, 35th Indiana, tells a story. He went to a post office with, like, I think it was $21,000 in
Wow.
1860 money. Can you imagine how much that was? And who else would the soldiers trust but a priest?
Mm,
So they had to slowly win. And then the last thing was courage. You had to have courage. Best chaplains were the ones. Now they weren't up front with the troops. They were back mostly with the hospital staff. But then after the battle had moved on, they would go over the battlefield and pull the troops off. Well, then sometimes they would get caught. Obviously,
mhm.
as you know, a counterattack would come. The priest would get caught in the battlefield, and that's how the one Catholic priest did get killed, Emmerin Blimel, with the 10th Tennessee. The Union, the Confederate had attacked and had taken the ground, and then the Union counterattacked with an artillery charge and infantry, and he got hit by a cannonball.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so he died anointing his officer. So those three things were really key. If you had those, faithfulness, flexibility, and courage, you earned the respect of the troops. And by the end of the war, the chaplain stood on a much higher standard. And they really set the standard for our modern military chaplaincy that we now have today. Basically, came out of what they did in the Civil War.
And to me, that's really interesting thinking about like, people weren't quite sure what the expectations for chaplains would be at the start of the war. And so they're sort of making up the job as they go along, trying to get rid of the parts that didn't succeed so well in previous service, but then creating kind of new roles for themselves.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah, and I just in my talk, I throw this out there. We celebrated this summer in June the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. Big hoop-de-doo. President Trump was there. J.D. Vance was there. SecDef was there, and everybody was celebrating it. People don't realize July of 1776, 250th anniversary of the chaplaincy.
okay.
The U.S. Army chaplaincy began 1 month later when Washington started it. So it's been around a long time. It's just slowly developed, and world Civil War is what really gave it its formal shape as we kind of begin to point in the direction we are today.
I'm thinking about those credibility issues that you mentioned too, where, like Jefferson Davis didn't necessarily have a high expectation for it. And then if you're working against um, hucksters who are sort of making things up on their own, and so there's one threat to your credibility. Then maybe anti-Catholic prejudice, that might be another threat to your credibility. So like it seems like these guys, as they're trying to weave through this very gray area, have a lot to prove, as you mentioned, but like they've got a lot to figure out too.
There's a funny story. I tell this story frequently. I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, but it's not important for the sake of the story. Father Joseph O'Hagan, Jesuit, one of the 21, served the Excelsior Brigade. Think Dan Sickles, obviously. So the officers were electing chaplains. And in the South, the officers would make a recommendation. Jefferson Davis would approve. And the Union, the officers would vote and take it. So O'Hagan, in a letter, describes the vote that it resulted in him being chaplain. It's something like this: of the officers that voted, 400 voted for a Catholic chaplain, 150 voted for any kind of a Protestant, three voted for a Mormon, and 250 said they could find their way to hell without a chaplain. So classic stories.
But it also seems to me, and I suppose this is my own hindsight looking back, but it does seem to me you're going into war. Here's a moment where people are going to be, struggling with those matters of faith and purpose and values and having these crises of faith. Like it seems like the perfect opportunity to have a chaplain, and yet maybe that wasn't what people were necessarily thinking right out of the bat.
Right, right, exactly. It gets into larger philosophical religious issues here,
Yeah.
what's the role of religion and faith in society and in people's lives? I do Civil War shows all over the country now. I have a whole booth I do on religion and faith in the Civil War, and people stop by and they say, whoa, I'm going to be at Gettysburg in 2 weeks actually at the show. And people stop by, and that's my first line. I'm dressed up like a chaplain. My first line is, when you're getting shot at in the war, you may not be a believer, but half your company is dropped to the ground and you're still surviving. Suddenly you find God.
Yeah.
And people immediately say, oh, yeah, there's no atheists in foxholes. And the war motivated people's faith. There's a shocker.
Yeah.
Trauma and tragedy motivate many, many people towards deeper faith. And that's exactly what happened in the Civil War. And I argue in a larger historical framework, I make this point in the end of the book, we need to believe in belief,
Ah,
historically speaking.
yeah.
You stop and think, and I'm not going to go into, I'm not going to get on my pulpit here, but how many times has faith had an impact in history? Crusades,
Right.
Islam, Christianity, Spanish, Spain, right? Northern Ireland, Islam today. I mean, so we blow off religion at our peril if we don't take it seriously. And certainly in the Civil War, religion and faith was a far more significant factor.
Right.
I believe I echo my friend Dr. Mark Knoll, who says religion and faith was at the time of the Civil War the most important social factor in America,
Yeah. Yeah.
mainly because there were no other overarching social factors. I
Mm,
mean, no Walmarts, no universal stores, which you bought in New York, you couldn't buy in New Orleans. Everything was local. Military's impact was pretty much limited to the big cities. The only national newspaper, I think, was Harper's, and that was what? Weekly, biweekly? I don't know what
right.
it was,
Yeah. Harper's
biweekly.
Weekly. Yeah.
So religion, who had influence more often was the religious groups who
Hmm.
had a unified structure nationally. So the potential was really there and influenced a lot of people. And a number of scholars have said that by the end of the Civil War, they estimate roughly half of the troops took religion seriously, faith seriously. Didn't mean they were in church all the time, but it did mean they somehow respected now the value of faith. And in my first book, I talk about that after the war, there was a big revival in male spirituality. Men were in church more. These men who'd fought together and prayed together, they tended to populate the churches much more, which often tend to be kind of dominated by women. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, and you mentioned too about, religion being such an important social factor. And with the revival that really sweeps through in 62 and 63, that amps it up even more, um, for a variety of different reasons that kind of sweeps through. But uh, is that, yeah, and so you mentioned there's this opportunity for the chaplains to kind of minister to these people who are finding their way to faith. What about those folks who also then like have their faith questioned because of the war? Like I believed in God, but how would God let all this happen around me? Like that's kind of the reverse effect.
that's a real good question that you could really make some fascinating questions on and dig out. Some of the journals I've read, some of the letters I've read, um, from the priest point of view, certainly real discuss as they walk into hospitals, for example, and they talk to people. There's some people that are very happy to have them come. Some don't want anything to do with them.
Hmm.
They're skeptics, they scorn it. So there's some people who really question what's going on. There's always been in history, but in that time, and I'm not an in-depth academic historian, but from what I understand about the history of that time, There would not have been today. Being agnostic or atheist is okay, it's accepted, whatever we feel about it. Somebody once said, the scholars have said, there were not many people who would profess publicly to be an atheist
Okay.
in the 19th century. They wouldn't. I mean, they may not go to church. They may think chaplains are clergy or worthless, but nobody is going to deny that, yeah, there's a God,
Uh-huh.
and that the Ten Commandments are pretty good guidelines for life.
Yeah.
General rule that's kind of universally accepted. So you're going to meet some of that. And then have not focused on the skeptic, shall we say, as much as some of the conversion stories, which are pretty profound. In fact, one of the great chaplains, Father John Bannon, who was with the Missouri troops, Sterling Price, Confederate Missouri troops, was captured at Vicksburg, and he was with one soldier who wound up being next to a Union Catholic, and he was a Southern Protestant. Oh my God, he was just furious at being stuck next to this guy, and he was swearing profoundly and da 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 da. And of course, Bannon tried to quiet him down and say, he knew the guy. He knew the guy because he was in the Missouri area
Yeah.
with him. And this guy was forced to lay with him. And so, but the guy went to Catholic, went to confession, professed his faith, and was very simple and sincere and humble. Bannon met that Southern agnostic skeptic 3 days later in a wagon, and he saw Bannon and called him over. He said, Chaplain, priest, come here. I want to ask for forgiveness. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about that. And
Okay.
please forgive me for this. Can I apologize to him? He said, no, he died by now. But he was so touched by his faith that he actually had a conversion experience. So
Yeah.
both sides were there. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say everybody converted. That's certainly not true. There were certainly many skeptics out there, but many people were touched when bullets start flying and cannonballs start soaring overhead.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and of course that touches on, the biggest of all sorts of questions where you're in the middle of
Yes,
a war and how can this be going on and how does God let these sorts of things go on? And like those are unanswerable questions, even
very
for the
much.
best of chaplains. So it must have been hard for a lot of them to be kind of in these crucibles as well.
Oh, yeah. I have a chapter in my other book, Both Pray to the Same God. I think I call it Through a Glass Darkly, and it reflects on that very point, Chris, the moral ambiguity
Yeah.
of war. And in the Catholic tradition, if people know, there's actually a principles for a justified war. Not that war is ever good, but it's tolerable under certain circumstances. But it gets so morally ambiguous. Some people tried to honor it. And one of the stories I tell in this book is about a soldier who I believe was a sharpshooter, and they had taken a position and they were trying to, the enemy, I think was the Confederates, were trying to pull an artillery piece off. And this guy lined up and had the artilleryman on the horse in his eyesight. He was going to shoot him, and he was a Christian. And he suddenly thought, I don't need to kill the guy. If I kill the horse, it'll
Okay.
accomplish the same purpose. So he shot the horse. The guy got off and got away, but they couldn't get the artillery piece off then.
Yeah.
And so he made the choice. It's strange how all the choices are made. So yes, that the chaplains wrestle with it too. This is why I love Father Sheeran's diary, 14th Louisiana. He is so open about his experiences. He was actually captured erroneously and mistakenly, had a case of mistaken identity and thrown into horrible prison in the north. And he almost despaired,
Yeah.
of his faith, because he was physically a wreck. He was tired. He was exhausted. Complete injustice had been done to him. He was mistaken for another Jesuit, by the way, who had stolen
Uh,
another priest's credentials. That's a fascinating story. And Phil Sheridan heard about this, and the guy, that priest, Father Bixio, stole the guy's credentials, got 3 wagon loads of supplies from the Union, drove them into Southern lines, and gave them away in Staunton, Virginia.
uh,
Sheridan heard about it. He was furious. So he arrested the first priest. That was Sheridan.
okay.
So Sheridan in his journal talks about how despairing he was. Now, luckily, he had some contacts and he was saved and got out. But
Uh,
some of those guys had some rough times,
wow.
going
Wow.
through this. Well.
And what was it like on a daily basis for these guys as they're wrestling with this stuff? I mean, to me, this seems like you're on the front lines in these terrible conditions, like you're out there doing Jesus's work, sort of thing, and for maybe someone who'd been at a parish back in the city or had life a little bit more comfortable, it's got to be a kind of a shocking sort of thing to
Oh yeah,
be, living
yeah.
the life this way.
Oh yeah, there's a couple different stories of guys who had a very difficult transition. One guy out of Notre Dame was sent down to Vicksburg because Sherman's wife, Ellen Ewing, was a strong Uber Catholic.
Right, right.
Sherman was but Ellen Sherman had two brothers in the Union Army who were officers and they were Catholic. So she had a chaplain sent down. She went to the head of Notre Dame, Father Soren, and said, "You need a chaplain." Well, actually, they had three, but she didn't know it. So she had a guy sent. This guy was totally unprepared for what he saw. And he was there at the bombing at the famous crater,
Oh yeah.
at the crater at Vicksburg when they tried to dynamite their way through the lines. And he saw so many people killed, it just filled him. They saw somebody shot in the head. And he went straight to his tent and lay down. And he was just stunned because he'd never seen this before in his life.
Right, right.
Then, to his credit, he recovered his wits and went back out and ministered again. But a couple people had a real tough time. There was a Jesuit named Truyans in Kansas. Only 3 months he served, but it was nearly all a Protestant regiment. And he too had a really rough time with them, served only 3 months. Not a lot of Catholics there, but he was still able to minister in some powerful ways. But their lives were truly touched too, and some of them had never had background, particularly some of the guys. I mean, if you're a Catholic priest, your training far exceeded any other denomination at that time. You spent 10, 12 years in the seminary or getting trained, so you didn't come out of that background. Plus, you didn't hoe in the fields or plow a field, so it was tough for a lot of guys to make that transition. That's why only of my list, Chris, of the 76 full time, what I call full time chaplain, as opposed to part time guys who had some other jobs, only 15 served 3 full years or more.
Right.
That's how tough it was. Corby was one, Sheeran was another one, O'Hagan was another one, by the way. Those are the
Yeah.
legends. But a lot of these guys, and in the last part of my book, I detail how many of them
Yeah.
were sidelined by sickness, and
Yeah.
I'd say a good third of them, probably no more than almost two-thirds, were affected for the rest of their life by some form of sickness. Six died during the war of sickness, and many others were affected for many years afterwards. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that was one of the things interesting, sort of the last portion of your book talks about like after the war, here are ways that their experience during the war sort of played out in different contexts. And one of those ways you talk about is these guys who had shorter term service versus longer term service, because so many guys were knocked out because of illness. And how does that inform, when they go back to the pulpit after the war, how does that how does that inform their perspective when they're going back versus someone who was there in the trenches the whole time?
yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Actually, that whole epilogue was a result of one of my readers of the text who wanted my book to kind of go in a different direction and
Yeah.
do a little more academic approach and follow them all through after the war and how it impacted the rest of their life. Well, that's 126 priests. It was hard enough just to get the
Yeah, right.
126 in the first place. So that was not my focus, but that's why that epilogue is there to point directions that could possibly be gone in. But a number of these guys, it clearly impacted their work. It affected their life. It went on to teaching careers. The guys at Notre Dame, for example, formed, everybody's heard of the GAR, Grand Army of the
Yeah.
Republic. Afterwards, people don't know the most unique GAR branch of all was formed in Notre Dame. And he had one requirement: you have to have been a Catholic religious who served in the war.
Oh, wow.
So, and these guys were venerated, revered. They would go to reenactments and or go to gatherings of the troops later on the war, and were called to give speeches or talk. And their lives were affected in tremendous ways. Down south, for example, obviously the South was just devastated because of the battles that happened predominantly in the South. But the priests down there um, were sent north a lot to raise money,
Okay.
and because they had known it, they'd been on the battlefield, they'd seen the devastated churches. There's some fascinating articles about how badly, and everybody's heard the horror stories. Union chaplains, Union cavalry, many times used churches, just to devastate them, border their horses in them. So these chaplains in the South, former chaplains, would go north to raise money to
Yeah.
rebuild, and because they could speak to the experience.
Yeah.
This is what it's like. And they would try to obviously tie in, now the war is over. We've got to come together. You need to help your Southern brothers and sisters as we try to rebuild the church.
Uh, there's also a really neat part that you talk about some of the interdenominational strides that happen
Yeah.
as a result. Tell me a little bit about that because I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's fascinating too. This was long before the era. Today, we're far more used to, yeah, priests and rabbis, priests and ministers getting together. It was a far more prejudiced world. And there was a lot of bias that went both ways. And I do express that in the book. But as always, there's some tremendous people for whom distinctions religiously didn't apply. Father Darius Hubert, it's called, there's a great book on him by Catherine Bentley, a friend of mine called First Chaplain of the Confederacy. He was a Jesuit, first chaplain named in the Confederate States. He was a friend of Jefferson Davis. And he was very famous for making contacts with a lot of other chaplains, even encouraging people who are not Catholic to go ahead and pursue a minister's career.
Yeah.
So he would work together with them ecumenically and things like that. There was opportunities for people in the union to come together over some joint funeral services, like the chaplains would have an association to come together. A lot of priests, some priests did not want to be part of that because they didn't want to be part of anything Protestant. But you have funerals all day long going on, and the chaplains would try to
Yeah.
take turns doing it. Some priests went along with it, would cooperate. Some were feisty curmudgeons that said, "Nope, I'm not having anything to do with those Protestants." So,
Yeah.
but there were some marvelous stories. I tell a couple in the book. There's a picture of a guy in the book from Rhode Island, Thomas Quinn, who had a great relationship with a Unitarian minister. As I mentioned, Darius Hubert was another one. One of my favorite ones is on the battlefield at Fredericksburg. It was O'Hagan. O'Hagan was in 73rd, as I mentioned before, Sickles Brigade, 73rd New York, and there was Twitchell was a Congregationalist pastor, and they were both ministering after Fredericksburg. And if you remember the history after the Battle of Fredericksburg that night, it was freezing, horribly cold. And so the two of them knew each other. They were in the same regiment. So they wound up next to each other underneath the tree and they were freezing to death. So finally they said, we got to do something. So they ended up spooning a Protestant chaplain. So they're spooning in this. And O'Hagan tells a story that they just started spooning after about 10 minutes later. There's Twitchell's kind of shaking. And Huygens said, "What are you shaking? Are you cold?" And he says, "No, I'm laughing." He says, What are you laughing about? It's horribly cold. We just lost people." He says, "I'm laughing at the two of us, a Catholic Jesuit priest and a Congregationalist minister spooning under the same blanket. I wonder what God would say." So, and they became good friends after the war. Although Twitchell has some funny comments, he visited O'Hagan at a Jesuit house and saw that they were smoking cigars and were not opposed to having a little drink. And his Calvinist tendencies had a little trouble with that.
You refer to the Jesuits as God's Marines in the
Yeah.
book. Where's that phrase come from?
That's a phrase along the line that I picked up in a couple different articles about the Jesuits, and I just kind of stole the phrase. It really comes from knowing their history in the church. They were post-Reformation, so right after Martin Luther, right after John Calvin, the church had just split in Europe, and it was kind of 30 years war, of course, 100 years war, and right after that was St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And he got the order approved, and Ignatius believed in that Jesuits, the priests needed to be intellectual, very strong intellectual people. So there, to this day, as we all know, there's Jesuit colleges all over the place. In fact, all the colleges in America at the time of the Civil War were Jesuit Catholic colleges. They had to be missionaries, be willing to go anywhere. So people like St. Francis, St. Vincent de Paul, or other
Mm.
people, some of the Jesuit missionaries, Pierre Marquette up the
Oh yeah.
Mississippi River in the Midwest was a Jesuit, and they had to be loyal to the Pope. So these guys came out like gangbusters, and they're in the 18th century, 17th century, because the Pope sent them to where there was trouble. So if there
Okay.
was a lot of Protestant stuff going on, they needed strong Catholic defenders, they sent the Jesuits. And then they were missionaries. They would go overseas. and proclaim missionaries. They're literally, I have to laugh and smile because the Jesuits literally every rock you turn up, there's a Jesuit. I could have ended this book 5 years ago, but I'm serious. I would start writing. I found another Jesuit. Then I'd write about him. I said, "Oh my God, there's another Jesuit," and
Yeah.
so I ended up adding on 4 or 5 more that I didn't know were around. So they were really the Marines. It's the best example I can use. They were sent by the Pope to go anywhere, everywhere, to bring the church's mission, values, and teaching, whether it's foreign lands, America, wars, or whatever.
Uh, to go back a second to that interdenominational experience that we talked about a second ago, did Catholics have like advantages or disadvantages during that revival where, you get a good fire and brimstone preacher who comes in and they're doing their thing and very charismatic versus someone who's got to say the mass in Latin, which people might not even understand. Um, what are the dynamics there? How does that play out?
Well, they wouldn't have preached in Latin.
Yeah.
For sure. So, I mean, yeah, the mass at the time was in Latin, and they would have said the mass in Latin, but some worship, some services they did were not in Latin. They would get the soldiers together just to pray,
Okay.
just to do a rosary, or they'd gather for an evening preaching,
Hmm.
and he would stand up on a barrel and preach, and some of these guys, and no surprise, the guys that came out of religious order backgrounds that focused on preaching, the Jesuits, for example, Dominicans were known as preachers. My two order, I was a former Redemptorist priest actually, and Father Sheeran was a Redemptorist. Both of
Okay.
them spellbinding preachers, and people would come and listen to them because they would. So again, people in those days, and Mark Knoll says this too, soldiers responded to good preaching
Yeah. Yeah.
still to this day.
Yeah.
And if they could preach well, they could bring them out and convince people out. Some priests tend to be curmudgeons, they would just narrow their ministry, but by and large, they were pretty good, especially the religious order priests at reaching out on others. Now there was what we call sheep stealing going on.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Many of the Protestants and O. Howard is a classic. He was a Methodist who was strongly missionary.
All right.
He was notorious for trying to get Catholics to leave and
Yeah.
become Methodist or something else. So there was a lot of sheep stealing going on at the time. But I think it worked the other way as too. And the
Yeah.
nuns, again, I could go back to the nuns, many stories about the nuns when you're on your deathbed and you want to know the Lord, and the nuns would be the ones. There's several stories where the nuns would be talking to a soldier who's dying, at 3 or 4 or 5, and the soldier says, "Okay, I want to be your religion." So she'd send the priest over
Yeah.
because the priest has to do the baptism. And several times, the soldier said, "I don't want that man. I want the woman. I want that woman." So finally, the nun would say, "No, that's okay. He's okay." And Bannon has a great story. The soldier wouldn't believe anything the priest said. And so he kept saying, "I ain't going to believe you unless the nun says it." She says, "Woman, is that guy true?" He said, "Oh yes, he's right. He's my son. You can believe him." So finally, Bannon baptized him. But Bannon wrote in a journal. He said, "I baptized him not in fide ecclesiam, in the faith of the church, but in fidem sedorum, in the faith of the nuns." He believed the nuns more than the church. So
Hey, whatever it takes, right?
whatever it takes, yeah.
So I'm sure there are some people who are wanting us to talk about Father Corby for a second. One of the things I like about the book is that there's not like a big Father Corby section, even though he's got the statue at Gettysburg and the Fair Catch statue at Notre Dame. But anything you want to say about him, because I'm sure there are some Father Corby fans out
Oh
there.
yeah, there's certainly a lot of Father Corby fans. I mean, if there's any chaplain, Catholic chaplain at all, chaplain period, that people know, it's Corby. And obviously the Gettysburg, second day of Gettysburg absolution is the big one, the general absolution when the Irish Brigade was getting to go into the wheat field. And he stood on the rock, and it was a very dramatic moment. And he gave the absolution, gave a little speech, and Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, notoriously profane. He watched it and he took off his hat. He's on record of taking off his hat. He said, "Something's going on here." General Zook, who had one of the brigades, afterwards came up to Corby and said, "Most spiritual event I've ever seen in my life." I couldn't believe it. So, but people think, oh, it was really unique, only time. Heck no. Corby and Priest did general absolution all the time.
Yeah.
Corby did it at Antietam. He did it at other places as well. I think he did it at Fredericksburg. Father Tracy did it 3 or 4 times. Father Cooney, 35th Indiana, did. Bannon did. They all did general absolution very, very much. That was key. Corby was well known because of St. Clair Mulholland, who was an officer in the Irish Brigade. And at post-war, people may or may not know this. They were trying to promote Irish Catholics in the country.
Right.
There's a strong movement in the North, not so much in the South, to promote that Irish had fought for the country, helped win the war. Da, da, da. And Mulholland thought Corby ought to get the Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
So he put it in. Well, you can't because he's not formally a soldier. So what
Mm.
happened was the statue.
Okay. All right.
Statue of Corby on the rock on the very place he was at. And of course, as you point out so well, his hand is up in the air, giving the absolution. And I've stood next to that statue, imitating him. And as you said so well, on Notre Dame, he's known as Fair Catch Corby. But I also wrote this whole book, the first one at Corby Hall.
Oh, okay.
And the Jesuits, I mean, the Notre Dame priests were very helpful in giving information. But Corby was just one of 7 altogether that served in the Irish Brigade. And there's actually a couple other people who served in the same Irish Brigade as he as well. I would argue, if you know Ed Bars at all, he was a good friend of mine and used to call me the Padre, the Padre. Ed Bars, I heard him say it once, Father Cooney, Peter Paul Cooney, 35th Indiana, no chaplain like Peter Paul Cooney. So he raved about Cooney in the 35th Indiana. So Corby was a great man, but there were others who certainly equaled him in his as well. And Cooney was in the war just as long as Corby was too.
Yeah, that's the one thing I love about the book is there are a lot of colorful characters that I think people
Very
will be
much.
delighted to meet, and I hope people find their own favorite chaplain as they go through there.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
we get ready to wrap up, and of course the book again called Faith of the Fathers. As we get ready to wrap up, anything in particular you want people to keep in mind as they come to your book and explore and discover these folks?
What I always say, Chris, is number one, I've argued that this whole area of religion and faith is kind of forgotten as we retell Civil War history for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we like the battles, we like the generals, we like the regiments, and colorful stories of Second Day at Gettysburg, things like that. But excuse me, we like that kind of stuff, but there's larger factors at work in all of this. And religion and faith was a key factor in many, many areas of the country and in people's life. And you don't understand the war unless you really understand its religious component. Part of our problem today, I think, is today America is a far more secular country.
Yeah.
Church attendance is down. We don't have a belief in the institutions. Back when I was growing up, the military, lawyers, government, clergy were much higher standard. Today, with all the stuff going on down, it's been trashed. So people say, well, it's not that important in my life, so it never was important. No, no, no,
Mm.
no. You do not know history. And that's why I come back to believe in belief. You've got to believe in the fact that belief and religion has been, and I'm talking purely objectively. I'm not bringing
Mhm.
religion into this, my personal beliefs at all. You've got to take religion and faith seriously as one of the greatest factors in the world, both positively and negatively. Because I could argue Hitler and Nazism was negative religion,
Right, right, right.
negative religion. So the impact of that. So that's why we need to take it seriously. And my field has been the Civil War. Appreciate the value of religion and faith. Whatever you think about it, honor it, respect it. And by the way, all these chaplains I write about, they're veterans. They're veterans. Let's not forget that. We honor veterans every year. These guys were veterans as well. They served, they died, they were shot at. Many of them were wounded, in various ways. So let's not forget to honor them as we honor the many people who served the country and on both sides during the war.
Yeah. Bob, I appreciate you bringing their stories to light and sharing them with us today.
Thank you, Chris.
So my pleasure. Thank
Happy
you
to
for
do
being with
that.
us. Yeah.
People will be around. I'm at Civil War shows. Everybody's listening to this. I'm going to be at Gettysburg in a couple weeks, Franklin in December, and in Georgia and spring. So I do a lot of shows, and still doing a lot of talks. I'll be in Virginia actually 4 nights in a row at roundtables in March of 2026. So giving a lot of talks on the topic, and I'm happy to. I have a big mouth, and I'm retired, and I will be willing to travel. So
The book,
so
Faith of the Fathers by Robert Miller from Notre Dame Press. Thanks so much for being with us today, Bob.
thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Likewise. I'm Chris Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.